Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth and final part of my retrospective series on Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. In the previous videos we looked at the events that led to the creation of 4th edition, the launch of 4th edition, the creation of Pathfinder, which was its competition, the release of D&D Essentials, and overall looked at the fact that try as they might, Wizards of the Coast just weren't able to succeed with 4th edition. And to say that 4th edition was a commercial failure is a fair statement. It was the shortest lived edition of Dungeons & Dragons, unless you count 3.0 to 3.5. D&D 4th edition was started in 2008 and technically ran until 2014 with the release of D&D 5th edition. However, as I mentioned previously, in 2012, Wizards of the Coast ceased publication of new materials for 4th edition. So it's more accurate to say that 4th edition ironically had a 4-year lifespan. So with this video, what I want to do is kind of do almost a post-mortem of 4th edition, because I think that it receives a lot of unfair criticism. And I think there's a lot of things that 4th edition did well. There are also some things that 4th edition certainly did poorly. So I want to kind of touch base on all of those things. I'm going to start with the more negative things because I want to end this on a more positive note. So what we're going to do is kind of dissect 4th edition D&D and see just what went wrong. 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons was doomed from the very beginning. From its announcement to the point when it was finally released and discontinued, it never really stood much of a chance. One of the main reasons for this is just the fact that Wizards of the Coast was losing faith with the consumers were losing faith, I should say, with Wizards of the Coast. Retailers were starting to become frustrated with Wizards of the Coast. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that if you look at 3rd edition and 3.5, 3rd edition did exceedingly well, but in 3 years it was replaced with 3.5. And, let's not mince words, 3.5 did replace 3rd edition. A lot of the books that were released for 3.0 weren't able to be easily or seamlessly carried over to 3.5. Changes to feats, skills, character class abilities, things of that nature, spell resistance, damage reduction, energy resistances, so much was changed that it was a hassle and a pain to try to convert things from one to the other. So the consumers pretty much dropped 3.0 when 3.5 came out. Now, 4 years after the release of 3.5, Wizards of the Coast is announcing 4th edition D&D, meaning that, a year from then, the collection of 3.5 that they had gotten just a few years previously was once again going to be rendered obsolete. Even worse, this translated over to the store owners as well. And when you're talking about, role-playing games or things that are kind of niche or hobby materials, these companies like Wizards of the Coast really need to rely on store owners as their form of marketing, as a way of getting the word out and trying to build excitement for their products. When 4th edition was announced, it met with a lot of backlash from retailers who had stockpiled 3.5 due to its popularity. So that very announcement, again, just made it very difficult for people to want to get on board with the new version of the game. 3.5 was still exceedingly popular and hadn't outlived its welcome at this point in time. So being forced a brand new edition just didn't really sit well with the players, or dungeon masters, retailers. It just didn't really sit well with anybody. Another big problem that 4th edition faced is after it was released, they actually went a step further than what the business model was for 3.5. 3.5 was a very supplement-heavy edition. It was built around the idea of releasing a ton of books, introducing new feats, character classes or prestige classes, magic items, all kinds of things that were meant to kind of keep the game fresh and going. 3.5 released a ton of material. 4th edition did the same thing, but in a lot of ways even worse. If you look at, the power books, there were a ton of those, pretty much 2 for each of the 5 different power sources, I believe. They split up the Draconomicon from 1 tome into 2. They had 3 different books dedicated to the cosmology of D&D, the Planar Handbook, and then ones dedicated specifically to the Astral Sea or the Elemental Chaos. They just released, even the players' handbooks were a huge issue, because people who were happy with the classes that were in 3.5 would be very frustrated to learn that a lot of the classes that they liked were not in the standard player's handbook. If they wanted to have the full assortment of classes that was introduced in 3.5, they would have to get that over 3 different players' handbooks, which were all released within 2 years of 4th edition first coming out. That's a lot of books to kind of expect or require the players to have. And relabeling all 3 players' handbooks, all 3 monster manuals, and both the Dungeon Master's guides as core rulebooks implied that you needed to have all of them. So that again was something that made it very difficult for people to want to get on board with 4th edition. Another one of the big problems of the failures of 4th edition was the fact that it was just play-tested poorly. And by that I mean that a lot of the new material that was introduced, like in the power books for example, wasn't really play-tested well in conjunction with things in the previously released players' handbooks. This did lead to situations where player characters could become powerful enough to take out epic level threats much earlier than intended and much quicker than intended, which made it difficult for DMs to run the game. If the DMs are running games where the player characters are running through their encounters, then naturally the DM is going to want to challenge the players more. And that can foster a sense of animosity between the Dungeon Master and the players, which can affect the fun of the game. So, using the playtesting method that they did for third edition, for example, it didn't work out well. It didn't work out well in 3rd edition, and again, it didn't work out well in 4th edition. So 2 years after the Player's Handbook and the core books were released, Wizards of the Coast would release an updated version of D&D called D&D Essentials. So this took place sooner than 3.0 to 3.5. And 3.0 to 3.5, that wasn't handled particularly well initially. And, for Wizards of the Coast to announce something eerily similar just 2 years after the release of your new version of the game was probably pretty much the death nail in the coffin for them. Other things that were working against 4th edition was the fact that they did make some really drastic changes, but they never really went into the reasons why they were making the changes. Changing the power structure, for example, the spell system, all those things, without really getting into, this is why we're doing this. It's just we're going to focus on the changes, which is also part of their marketing, which was atrocious during this era. If you want to look at their examples of bad marketing, look at 3.5, how they introduced that, how they promoted that by focusing on sort of the elements that were the most drastic changes, which is what they did with 4th edition. And that's the same thing that they did when they introduced Eberron. They made the campaign setting just kind of sound awful instead of trying to accentuate all the positive elements of it. So the marketing and the drastic nature of the changes was again something that worked really poorly against 4th edition. Not to mention that there were also some pretty serious criticisms that were leveled against 4th edition. So I want to get into some of those that I consider to be maybe not fair or misplaced on 4th edition. So I'm going to go over some of those here next. So when it comes to 4th edition, players and gamers were just not happy with the game altogether. And when I asked a lot of people why they didn't like 4th edition, or if I was reading forums or threads about it, or even just simply posts on role-playing pages on Facebook, comments in videos where people talked about 4th edition, there were a few common criticisms that are leveled against 4th edition, which I don't really consider to be overly fair or perhaps potentially too harsh. So I'm just going to go through those in no particular order. So let's just kind of start with one of the first and biggest complaints that 4th edition usually gets. And the biggest thing that 4th edition usually gets is the statement that it's not Dungeons & Dragons. This is the one that I always found the hardest to kind of understand. Normally when people say it's not Dungeons & Dragons and you ask them to elaborate, the most common argument is, they changed the spell system, they changed the way character classes are done. And that's sort of fair, but if you look back at 3.5, for example, the traditional magic system that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had for 1st and 2nd edition was one where the spellcasters had to prepare their spells ahead of time and hope that when they proceed through the adventure, that the spells that they picked are going to be useful for that adventure. which can be a very difficult thing to do at times. When 3rd edition came out, the rigid spell system that was put in place with 1st and 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had already begun to change. If you look at the clerics, for example, clerics no longer had to memorize cure spells if you were good aligned. Which most player characters presumably were, or if they were neutral, they worshipped a god that would allow them to do what was called spontaneous curing. And what that was is if you were good aligned or neutral aligned and made the choice, and your god allowed it, you could swap out a memorized spell for a cure spell of the equivalent level. So a first level cleric would not have to memorize Cure Light Wounds. They could memorize other spells that they thought might be useful, but if they need to cure, then they can sacrifice one of those spells and instead cast Cure Light Wounds for that level. The same would be for, a 2nd level spell could be converted to Cure Moderate Wounds, 3rd level spell could be turned into Cure Serious, 4th level into Cure Critical. And of course you could use a higher level spell slot for a lower level version. So that was one of the big changes that already happened to magic systems that made the spellcasters a little bit more flexible as far as the clerics go. The wizard in 3rd edition still stuck to the rigid you need to have the spells memorized ahead of time, but Wizards of the Coast also introduced the sorcerer class, which was able to cast all of their spells spontaneously, meaning they didn't have to prepare any of them in advance. The downside was that they had potentially fewer spells to choose from, but the fact of the matter was that even though they may not have been able to have learned as many spells as a wizard, they had the ability to pick useful utilitarian spells, combat spells, and be able to use them in any order that felt necessary. Unlike a wizard that would have to memorize their spells ahead of time, and again, when combat came, or the adventure came, if the spells didn't really coalesce with what was going on, then they were more or less useless. Wizards didn't have the ability to spontaneously cast spells until you got to Forgotten Realms. Really introduced the signature spell feat, which allowed you to swap out a spell for one that is your kind of trademark spell. So the fact that the sorcerer was introduced was already, again, a drastic change to the way that they did the spell system. And in my experiences, in most of the campaigns that I either played in or ran in 3.0 and 3.5, which was running from 2000 until about 2012, very few players, if any, would actually choose a wizard, and most of them would go for the sorcerer. I would say about 96% of the arcane spellcasters, player characters in the campaigns that I was involved in, were spontaneous casters. Now again, the clerics, divine spellcasters are a little bit different, but they had that ability to swap out cures, which is the thing you'd want to swap out for anyway. This, for the arcane classes, got even more drastically changed when Complete Arcane came out and introduced the War Mage. The War Mage focused on purely combat spells, with the ability to learn a couple of other spells down the road as they progress through levels, but they cast quite a few of these spells, and they also did more damage with them than a sorcerer or wizard could. They also had the ability to wear armor, had better weapon proficiencies, and were all around just kind of a class more tailored to the playstyle that 3rd edition tended to promote. And in the last few campaigns that I ran, the arcane spellcaster was a war mage, and my last 2 campaigns in 3.5, 2 different players played war mages, and they both played them the exact same, even though they were completely different people. So when it comes to the fact that 4th edition introduced at-will encounter and daily powers, especially for the spellcasters, people may have been upset with that. But the fact of the matter is that the traditional, Vancian magic, if you want to call it that, where you have to prepare a limited number of spells and stick to those until you get a chance to rest and change them, was something that was already being kind of pushed aside in 3.5 in favor of classes that allowed for more flexibility. The change that they made for that in 4th edition, in my opinion, was actually for the better, but I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later on in the video. Another common criticism that I hear when it comes to 4th edition is that it kills role-playing. So this is sort of a two-part thing. So the two parts are that it killed role-playing and that it promotes nothing but combat. So let's just start with the combat part first. Fourth edition is a combat-heavy version of Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not going to argue that. Much of the way that the game is structured is built around the combat system. But the same could also be said more or less for third edition as well. Third edition was very combat-heavy, and if anyone's ever looked at the pre-written campaign paths for third edition, especially the ones in Dungeon Magazine, all of those boil down to dungeon crawls and nothing but tons of combat at the higher levels. So that's not something that's necessarily unique to 4th edition being very combat heavy. It's also worth remembering that Dungeons & Dragons was built off of a tabletop miniature war games, which was all about combat. So even going back to 0 edition, the game was built around a combat system. And, while you had the opportunity or the ability to do things outside of just combat, that's up to the DM to do, and it's up for the players to be interested in. Which brings us to the fact that it killed role-playing. Most of the time when people say that, they talk about the skill system and how they had skills like diplomacy and bluff and things along those lines, or intimidation, where the player characters would want to either use a diplomacy check, intimidate, or a bluff check, and instead of trying to say what the character would actually, use to convince them using this roll, they would simply roll the dice, add their bonus, and say, well, I got a 22, so whatever my character says, it would make sense for the game, and it would be convincing. And this is one of those things that a lot of people talk about. And again, it was something that was very prevalent in 3rd edition. The skill system in 4th edition is a refined version of the skill system introduced in 3rd edition. 3rd edition had Intimidate, it had Diplomacy, and it had Bluff. And I remember many instances where players wanted to use those skills and weren't interested in trying to role-play out the scenario. They would simply say, well, I make a bluff check, this is what I get, so it seems pretty good. So that was a problem that dated back all the way to like the year 2000, 8 years before the release of 4th edition. So it may have put more prevalence on those skills, but the skill system was developed for 3rd edition, and it was used a lot in 3rd edition. Many adventures had situations where it recommends that the players make a diplomacy check or an intimidate check. And again, it doesn't really specify things that the player characters need to say. And the skills were presented in such a way that it didn't really specify that you needed to roleplay the scenario out. When it comes to role-playing, groups are going to roleplay as much or as little as they want. Going back to even some 2nd edition games that I played, people weren't interested in role-playing scenarios. They wanted to just go through, loot dungeons, kill monsters, and that was it. If you look at Knights of the Dinner Table, for example, or the Hackmaster role-playing game, which caters to the hack and slash type of gaming, that comic and that game was introduced during the days of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So again, it's nothing necessarily new. There are groups that didn't want to role-play as far back as probably 0 and 1st edition AD&D. So again, those are interesting criticisms, but I don't think that they're specific to 4th edition. And I'll touch a little bit on sort of as part of the skill system again later on in the video when I get to things that I think were positively done. And actually, we may as well just segue into that right now. 4th edition D&D isn't as bad as everybody makes it out to be, and that's my honest belief. I was one of those people that when 4th edition was first announced, I was dead set against it. I had no interest in it whatsoever, and even though my mother got me a player's handbook for Christmas in 2008 when 4th edition first came out, it was almost 3 years from the time that I got that book to the time that I finally opened it up and gave it a chance. And once I did, I kind of regretted the fact that I took so long to get there. So there are some things that I consider that 4th edition did exceptionally well that don't really get talked about, and were definitely not part of the marketing strategy that Wizards of the Coast had. So let's just talk about a few of those. One of the first things that I want to touch on is the skill system. I really like the way that skills were handled in 4th edition. They got rid of the skill point system, which was kind of a bit of a pain to deal with. because you would have classes, no matter how many skill points you got, you just never really had enough to make your character effective at things. Fourth edition changed that by replacing skill points with trained and untrained skills. So all of your skills that you get through the game, you get to add half of your level to as a bonus on top of the relevant ability score. So it means that you're going to have decent bonuses as you progress through levels for every single skill in the game. The trade-off is that your class, character class, and perhaps your race gives you the ability to be trained in certain skills. Being trained in certain skills gives you an extra +5 bonus, as well as for a few different skills unlocks the ability to do different things with them. Like I think Knowledge Arcane, if you're trained in it, you're able to use things like Detect Magic, I think, or Identify. One of those two. So they also streamline the skill system to get rid of redundant skills. So Hide and Move Silently were finally combined together in Stealth, and Spot, Search, and Listen were all combined into Perception, which is basically what you're doing. You're either looking for something or trying to hear something. So having Search and Spot as two different things, again, was kind of a bit of a pain to deal with, and again, you were splitting up your skill points in 3rd edition trying to get all those things. For example, the Rogue class, which got an impressive 8 skill points plus their intelligence modifier per level, had some skills that were considered essential that they had to always put points into. So those skills would be something like hide in shadows, move silently, spot, listen, search, disable device, and probably use magic device. So of your 8 skill points that you're getting per level, 7 have already been predetermined, leaving out certain ones that you may also want to have on top of it. So those changes were altogether positive. Another thing that is usually looked at negatively for 4th edition that I think is actually a positive aspect is the introduction of the skill challenge. So what the skill challenge is instead of allowing the player characters to achieve a certain goal by rolling a single skill check, a skill challenge is a series of skill checks that the player characters have to make in order to obtain some sort of goal. These could be things like diplomatic things, like trying to persuade an enemy perhaps not to attack you, persuading a villainous group that could be a mutual ally against this other villainous group to join you, or just persuade a noble to provide resources. So those are the social ones. They could also be used to locate perhaps a secret lair used by a thieves guild, tracking somebody through a busy street during like a sort of a chase scene type of thing. There's just all kinds of different possibilities. The beauty of the skill challenge is that you're not using the same skill over and over and over again. It's not like you're able to roll 8 diplomacy checks in order to overcome it. You actually usually have to use several different skills in order to overcome the challenge. And what's great about that is that it kind of gets the players thinking in creative ways. For example, if you're trying to win the the attention or the affection or the positive will of a nobleman, for example, you can't just make the diplomacy checks. You may have to do something like make a knowledge history check to go over the history of how the family's standing has always been in this town or city, and how well they've been received in the past, how generous their predecessors have been. You could also use things like streetwise in particular ways. If you are aware of the fact that they may be dealing with some shady characters, you could kind of use that way. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can use the skills, but you have to use different skills. You don't have to make 8 separate different skill checks, but you have to usually have about 2 or 3 different skills that you're using throughout the challenge. Skill challenges were typically, I think, handled poorly, and I don't think that they were explained in the best way possible. They could be something that were short term as a single role-playing encounter, or they could be sort of stretched out over the course of a campaign. And I think some point after this I wanted to actually dedicate a video to a long-term skill challenge that I had designed for a campaign that I never actually quite got to run. But again, I think the fact that it promotes creative thinking with the skill system, even if players aren't comfortable with the role-playing elements, if they come up with a good idea how to use a skill, in the part of this particular challenge, then that's something that is, in my opinion, a great thing and should be rewarded. So I think that they were handled poorly. I think that they were explained poorly and promoted poorly. But I think overall, they make a situation where if your group's not comfortable with role playing, you still get them thinking outside of just regular combat and swinging your weapons type of thing. Another thing that I actually think is a positive change for 4th edition is the kind of controversial decision to change the way that they structured the game. And by that I mean the power system. Having the at-wills, encounters, and daily powers is something that is quite different from what D&D had been, but I think is something that was looking towards the future. For example, playing a spellcaster, primarily spellcaster like a wizard, can be very tedious, especially at lower levels when you have very few spell slots. In AD&D, for example, if your wizard only had one spell and you cast that one spell for the day, you were pretty much useless until you got a full 8 hours of rest to prepare another spell. So having things like at-will powers means that you always had something you could use. Having encounter powers meant that you always had a decently powerful ability that you'd be able to utilize in combat when combat did come. And having the daily powers is just like one massive power that could be used against boss monsters or a situation where things are starting to go south. You can kind of break that out. But you were never left without the ability to use some of your class abilities, your class features. A wizard always being able to cast Magic Missile, for example, makes them infinitely more useful than a wizard that ran out through their entire allotment of spells and is now trying to fight with like a longbow or a crossbow, or even just swinging with their quarterstaff and being less than effective. It makes it fun for the players to always have something that they can do. So I think that that is a positive thing all around. I know a lot of people talk about, the game being focused on combat, and another criticism is that it requires a grid to use, which it does for the most part. I mean, you can probably try to do it without a grid, but it would be a bit difficult, and it would require the DM to really keep careful track of where everybody is. But using the grid isn't necessarily new to 4th edition 3.5. There are many campaigns that we insisted on using miniatures because of things like attacks of opportunity and reach and things like that, and trying to center spells and try to get as many targets as possible type of thing. So 4th edition did do that, and again, I know that a lot of people may not necessarily like that, but you also have to look at it from the point of view that Wizard of the Coast is a business, and they want to make money, which is something that I think all businesses want to do. At this point in time, Wizards of the Coast was heavily producing their own miniatures. The miniatures were produced for a separate miniatures game, but they also were used for the role-playing game, and they were promoted as being usable for the tabletop miniatures game or the role-playing game. And if you've got all these miniatures that you're releasing and had been releasing since 2003 in this format with the random plastic pre-painted minis, it only makes sense from a business standpoint to create your role-playing game based around the fact that you want your players to buy these miniatures. It may not be the most consumer-friendly thing because it's getting them to spend more and more money. But the miniatures game was decently successful. People were buying it, so why not have them have another use for these miniatures? So I know that that's often looked at as a negative thing, but I think it was a smart thing for the business, and something that I kind of wish that they would do more of in the current edition, where they do have miniature lines. They're not being produced by them. They contracted out to WizKids, but it would be nice to see some support for those miniatures within the role-playing game. Another thing that I think 4th edition did exceedingly well is the change to magic items. 3.5 and 3.0 both changed magic items in a way that I think was for the worst. They made them in such a way that your players would build their characters around not what they wanted to choose for necessarily just feats and skills, but they would build their characters around which magic items they needed. Having the ability to customize weapons and armor, for example, made it a huge hassle for the DMs because the players would want to have these specific abilities applied to their weapons. In 4th edition, they went back to the AD&D style of having the weapons be, or magic items in general, being mostly single purpose, with a single ability that they have, making magic items not so much an essential part of your character build, but having them be nice things that you can find as a reward for particularly challenging encounters. You're not going to have a +4 keen, icy burst, axiomatic, holy longsword. You may have a longsword that deals extra fire damage, cold damage, or maybe just have like the dancing weapons and stuff like that. But they're not as customizable, which in my opinion is a good thing. Because again, it makes them nice to find, but it's not going to make it so that the player characters will go to great lengths to acquire the specific combination of abilities that they want for their weapon and armor. It's also nice that they got away from the stat boosting items as well. So, for example, Gauntlets of Ogre Power, instead of increasing the strength score, give you bonuses on strength-based checks, as well as, I think, once per day you can deal a fair amount of extra damage on a successful attack. So just things like that I think was actually really well done, and it changed the dependence on magic items for 4th edition, which I've often heard people say that 4th edition is more dependent on finding magic items, but I never really understood that because the magic items are a little bit more restricted in what they do, and nothing in the game really requires you to have them as such. Another thing that I think is a very positive change is the redesign to monsters. I like the fact that monsters were no longer statted out in the same way that you would do a player character, and that if you wanted your villain or NPC to have a unique ability, you didn't have to jump through hoops to justify it like you would have to in 3rd edition or 3.0, or 3.5 I should say. So I thought that was a really cool aspect of the game. I also like the way that they did monsters with the minions and the solos and things like that, because I've run into encounters before in 3.5 which were meant to be one monster against a group of player characters, and that monster is always going to get decimated because the player characters can just deal so much damage to it. So I thought that was a cool change. I also like what they did with resistances and vulnerabilities. So they got rid of damage reduction, which was a huge relief when I finally realized that in 4th edition. 3.5 went overboard with damage reductions, where you would have to have a magical weapon that's either silver and holy, or just all these different abilities, and very few things had the same requirements to overcome the damage reduction, meaning that you would have to have multiple weapons if you were dealing with multiple types of enemies. Very frustrating, very difficult to keep straight, and to this day I still can't remember between Demons and Devils which one was Cold Iron, which one was Silver, because I think they both required good aligned weapons, and anyway, it was just a mess. In 4th edition, rather than punish you for not having the incorrect weapon type, you can be rewarded by having the proper weapons. So if something is vulnerable to a silver weapon and you have a silver weapon, you deal a set amount of extra damage on top of what you would normally do. And to me, that's so much better, because it takes, the way that resistance works, which subtracts a certain amount of damage of a given type, and just does the exact opposite. By dealing extra damage of a set amount if you have the particular damage type that is vulnerable to. So I think that, again, those are very positive changes. Overall, I think 4th edition's legacy is one that is unfairly judged based on consumer outrage at the time, based off the fact that it wasn't marketed well, and just based on the fact that Wizards of the Coast had a hard time kind of getting it off the ground. When they released D&D Essentials, a lot of people were turned off by that, but I actually liked the Essentials line, and I would have been okay with them using that format for D&D going forward. If they wanted to get away from the expensive hardcover books in exchange for having, the soft cover, maybe smaller books, I would have been totally okay with that. Having box sets for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, totally would have been okay with that as well. But it was just an edition that just didn't have a lot going for it. It was released, I think, way too far ahead of its time. I think the changes that were made were well-intentioned, but poorly executed, poorly explained, and again, just a little bit too ahead of their time. If there would have been something in between, then the change to 4th edition as it is now could have made sense if it was a few editions down the road. That being said, 4th edition is actually, in my opinion, one of the most important versions of D&D for a few different reasons. Number one is it kind of gave gamers something like a cause to kind of get behind. It gave them the ability to show Wizards of the Coast that, they weren't happy with the way that they were running things. They were able to, galvanize themselves against 4th edition, which I don't think is fair, but I think in the end it ended up being overall positive for the D&D brand going forward. Consumers showing their support for Pathfinder, for example, show Wizard of the Coast that, maybe there was a potential to do something more in line with what was popular in the past. Now that's kind of debatable, because I think if they would have released something similar to Pathfinder, consumers still wouldn't have been happy, because it was just another version of D&D coming out, 5 years after the last one. So there was just no getting around that, in my opinion. But it gave the Wizard of the Coast the ability to look at something and say, okay, people are really passionate about role-playing games. They're really passionate about Dungeons and Dragons. So now that we know that, we can start working on creating a version of the game that's going to appeal to those people. I think it's also very important because it showed that Wizards of the Coast was willing to go outside of their normal comfort zone. And I think that's something that should be more praised than necessarily criticized. It took, in my opinion, quite a bit of courage on their behalf to go from what they had with 3.5 into something so drastically different. And I think it shows a willingness to try to adapt to the times. Was it the best execution of that? Probably not at that point in time, but it did lead to better things down the road. Another thing that I think was really positive about 4th edition and the backlash against it is it proved, I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Wizards of the Coast had to look at how they develop role-playing games, how they play test their role-playing games. Looking at the success of the Pathfinder playtest system, where they had the consumers do the playtesting, is something that played a very pivotal role in what was to become Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And I'm not sure that they ever would have come to that realization had they not have released 4th edition. 4th edition, creating its competition, in the end made Dungeons & Dragons a stronger game. As far as the changes themselves go, again, I like them. I think that they're easier for new gamers to learn. And I remember when I was, my fiance expressed an interest in trying to learn the game, if for no other reason than just to give me something to do type of thing. We started with 3.5, and she played a wizard in that, and she had a kind of a difficult time wrapping her head around the difference between character level, spell level, and things like that. So after a session of that, I decided to switch to 4th edition, and she enjoyed that a lot more, because it made more sense. And I think, honestly, in my opinion, if 4th edition had have been released under any other role-playing brand, I don't think the reception against it would have been as negative. I think the fact that it carried the Dungeons & Dragons name made it difficult for players to accept something so drastically different. I think if it would have been released as a different type of fantasy role-playing game, a lot of the things that players hate about it now are things that they may have been fans of or even praised, especially with the ability to have your at-will powers where you can always do something regardless of whether or not you're out of your regular spells. 4th edition is highly influential in the current 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which I'm not going to get into so much here. I'm going to save that for the next video. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this series, and I wanted to put a lot of work into my 4th edition videos, just because I genuinely enjoy 4th edition. At this point, when I'm recording this video, which is just the beginning of January 2017, I'm actually in the process of trying to start up a 4th edition game with the group that are more familiar with this system. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm genuinely enjoying the thought of running another 4th edition game. As much as I love 5th edition, I still greatly enjoy 4th edition and would have no problem running it at any point in time. So anyway, again, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm hoping that, it may persuade people to be a little bit more fair when they look at 4th edition. Maybe not be so just outright hostile to it, and just kind of look at why they made the changes that they did. Were the changes to their powers done to capitalize on the MMO craze? Absolutely, but there was also the philosophy behind it that they didn't want player characters to feel useless once they had done something. They wanted all the classes to be good at something. So they made, the rogues have just as good, of an attack with their weapons as a fighter would with their weapons, even though they're using two completely different weapon sets, different armor sets, and have different abilities, but they still wanted all the characters to be good at something. It's probably one of the most well-balanced editions as far as character classes are concerned, and it made it easier for you to step outside of that zone of I'm always playing this class, but I kind of want to try this one, and this edition made that easier and more intuitive. So I think there's a lot of positive aspects of 4th edition that don't really get talked about, and I'm hoping that this raised some awareness towards it. Anyway, that concludes my look at 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I hope you enjoyed the series. We're almost done with this retrospective, because up next we're going to look at D&D 5th edition.